2 years after humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, the galaxy had transformed into something unrecognizable to those who had known the old order. The Council still existed in name, but its chambers echoed with emptiness as species after species withdrew to handle their own affairs. And the Great Assembly that had once governed 347 civilizations now struggled to maintain quorum with barely 100 remaining members. Ambassador Uniseong stood on the observation deck of Unity Station, the central hub of the independent species alliance that humanity had helped create in the vacuum left by the Council's decline. And she watched ships from dozens of worlds arriving for the annual summit. The alliance operated on principles that the Council had never understood, with no mandatory treaties and no restrictions on sovereignty and no votes that could override the wishes of member species. For it was built on voluntary cooperation and mutual benefit rather than ancient hierarchies and enforced compliance. The Delosi delegation has arrived, her aide reported, and Trade Minister Alexia is requesting a private meeting before the formal sessions begin. Yuna nodded and made her way to the meeting room where Alexia waited. And she remembered the then minister who had sat silently in the council chambers while humanity was condemned. And she wondered what kind of person that minister had become. Alexia rose as Yuna entered, and her compound eyes reflected emotions that were difficult for humans to read, but that Yuna had learned to interpret over many years. "Thank you for seeing me," Alexia said. "And I know that I have no right to ask anything from humanity after what my people did. You voted against us," Yuna acknowledged. "But you also tried to warn us about the boundary accord before the vote. And you sent messages seeking reconciliation when others were still laughing at our departure." Alexia's antennae drooped with shame. "I was too cowardly to speak publicly," she admitted. "And I told myself that one voice would not matter. And I convinced myself that quiet sympathy was enough. And I was wrong about all of it. What do you want now?" Yuna asked. "I want to formally join the alliance," Alexia replied. "And I want to bring my sector with me. And I want to apologize on behalf of everyone who should have spoken up and did not." Yuna studied the minister for a long moment before responding. "The alliance does not require apologies," she said, "for we care only about actions. And if your sector is willing to cooperate as equals and respect the sovereignty of other members, then you are welcome to join." Relief flooded Alexia's features. "I must also ask," she continued hesitantly, "whether humanity harbors resentment toward those who wronged you. For I need to know if my people will face punishment for past behavior." Yuna shook her head. "Resentment is a weight that slows you down," she said. "And we chose to put it aside and focus on building something better, and the old relationship is gone forever. But that does not mean we cannot build a new one." She extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement. And after a moment of surprise, Alexia reached out with one of her 4 arms and accepted the handshake far from Unity Station. Captain Dowan Park commanded the humanitarian vessel Steady Horizon on a mission to the devastated outer regions that had suffered most from the Vashka raids and the Council's collapse. His crew worked alongside local volunteers to repair damaged infrastructure, distribute food and medical supplies, and train emergency responders who could maintain stability after the humans departed. Captain called Dr. Soyin Kim from the medical tent. "We have another wave of refugees arriving from the Karathi border zone." Park surveyed the crowded camp that had grown to hold 10,000 displaced persons. And he thought about how different this mission was from the supply runs he used to make under Council authority. "Take care of them," he ordered, "and make sure everyone gets screened for injuries and illnesses. And contact the local authorities about expanding the camp boundaries." A young Delosi volunteer approached him with curiosity in her eyes. "Why do you help us?" she asked. "For your people suffered greatly under the Council, and we did nothing to defend you. Park considered the question carefully before answering. "Because helping others is who we are," he said. "And that did not change when we left the council. And it will not change regardless of how others treat us. But you could demand payment or concessions or political advantages." "We could," Park agreed. "But then we would become what the council was. And we would measure everything by what we could gain. And we would lose the part of ourselves that makes these missions worthwhile." The volunteers seemed confused by this reasoning, and Park smiled at her bewilderment. "Give it time," he suggested, "and maybe someday you will understand." On the abandoned council station, High Arbiter Thelvosk sat alone in the empty chambers where he had once commanded the attention of hundreds of species. And he stared at the vacant seats that had once held delegates from across the galaxy. His advisors had all departed to seek positions with other governments, and his staff had dwindled to a handful of loyal assistants. And the great council that had governed for 10,000 years had become a hollow shell waiting to collapse. He thought about the human ambassador who had placed her seal on the podium and walked away. And he remembered his certainty that she was making a catastrophic mistake. And he finally understood how completely wrong he had been. Humans had not needed the council. The council had needed humans. And by the time anyone realized this truth, it was far too late to change anything on the colony world of Danwan in the central plaza of New Seoul. Ambassador Yuna Seong attended a celebration marking the second anniversary of humanity's independence from the Galactic Council. Children ran through the crowds laughing and playing games, while adults shared food and stories and music from 100 different Earth cultures, and the evening sky filled with colors from fireworks that painted temporary constellations. Above the city, a young girl approached Seong with the fearless curiosity that children possessed. "Ambassador," she asked, "will humans ever rejoin the council?" Seong knelt down to meet the girl's eyes. "Do you know what the council was?" she asked. The girl nodded. "It was a government that told everyone what to do," she said. "And it treated humans badly because we were new." "That is right," Seong confirmed. "And what do you think about that?" The girl considered the question with serious concentration. "I think it was mean," she decided, "and I think we are happier now." Seong smiled and looked around at the celebrating crowds in the peaceful city and the stars overhead that represented possibilities rather than restrictions. "I think you are right," she said. She stood and watched the girl run back to her friends, and she thought about all the challenges that still lay ahead for humanity, the threats they would face and the problems they would solve, and the future they would build together. But she also thought about how far they had come since that day in the council chambers when she had chosen dignity over acceptance, and she felt a deep certainty that whatever happened next, humanity would face it the same way they had faced everything else, together. And on their own terms, the fireworks continued to light up the sky, and somewhere in the crowd, someone began singing an old Earth song about hope and perseverance. And gradually others joined in until the whole plaza echoed with voices raised in celebration of what humanity had become. Not conquerors or rulers or masters of the galaxy, simply free. And that was enough. 14 months after humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council, a diplomatic vessel bearing the official seals of 300 species crossed into human territory and requested permission to dock at Border Station 12. Ambassador Yuna Seong, now serving as Border Commissioner for the region, reviewed the request with a mixture of curiosity and caution. For this was the first official council delegation to seek contact since she had placed Earth seal on the podium and walked away. "They are requesting a formal meeting," her aide reported, "and the delegation is led by High Arbiter Thelvosk himself. And they say they come with a proposal for renewed relations." Yuna considered the request for a long moment before responding. "Grant them docking permission," she said. and prepare conference room 7 for a formal meeting. And make sure they understand that this is a courtesy, not a negotiation." The council vessel docked 3 hours later, and High Arbiter Thelvosk led his delegation through the human station with eyes that showed barely concealed desperation beneath his attempted dignity. Una noticed immediately that his scales had lost their former luster, and the confident posture she remembered had been replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone carrying an unbearable weight. And she felt a brief moment of sympathy before reminding herself why they were in this situation. The delegations faced each other across a simple conference table, and Thelvosk wasted no time with diplomatic pleasantries. "I have come to offer humanity full equality within the Galactic Council," he announced, placing a data chip on the table, "and this proposal includes unrestricted expansion rights, voting power equal to the founding species, a formal apology from the Council Assembly, and reparations for past unfair treatment." Una did not touch the data chip. "That is a generous offer," she acknowledged, "and it would have been acceptable 14 months ago, before the vote that showed us exactly what the Council thought of humanity. Circumstances change," Thelvosk said carefully, "and the Council has recognized its error, and we wish to make amends." "What changed?" Una asked simply. The High Arbiter hesitated, and in that hesitation, Una saw the truth that his diplomatic words tried to hide. "The galaxy faces certain challenges," he admitted slowly, "and there have been economic difficulties and security concerns, and some instability in various sectors. Be specific." Una pressed Thelvosk's composure cracked slightly as he listed the crises that had consumed the Council since humanity's departure, including the trade network collapse and the Vashka raids, and the medical emergencies and the refugee streams and the political fractures that threatened to dissolve the alliance that had governed for 10,000 years. "We need humanity to return," he finally admitted, "for the galaxy cannot function without you." Una let the silence stretch before she responded. "Let me understand," she said. "For 47 years, you told us we were a young and primitive species that should be grateful for any attention the Council gave us. And you restricted our growth and dismissed our concerns and voted unanimously to cage us forever. And now that your civilization is falling apart, you want us to come back and fix everything. We made mistakes," Thelvosk acknowledged with obvious difficulty, "and we are prepared to correct them. But you do not actually believe you made mistakes," Una said, and her voice carried the weight of certainty. "For you believe you were right all along, and you only want us back because you are suffering, and the moment the crisis passes, you will return to treating us exactly as you did before. That is not true." The High Arbiter protested. "Then answer me honestly," Una challenged, "and tell me whether you would have offered these terms if your economy was strong and your borders were secure, and your civilization was thriving." Thelvosk opened his mouth to respond and then closed it again. For even he could not bring himself to speak that particular lie. "That is what I thought," Una said quietly back on Earth and the human colony worlds. Youth leader Soha Yoon organized community meetings to discuss the Council's offer and gather public opinion on the question of potential return. She stood before a gathering of 3,000 citizens in the central plaza of New Seoul on the colony world of Danwon, and she presented the terms that the Council had offered and asked for reactions. The responses came quickly and passionately. "They only want us when they need us," shouted an elderly man who had spent 20 years as a doctor on Delosi stations. "And I saved thousands of lives out there, and they still voted to restrict us. So why should we trust them now? We have built something good here," added a young woman who had never known life under Council membership. "And our trade networks with independent species are growing, and our borders are secure. And we do not need their permission to be successful. What about the people suffering in council space? Asked a more cautious voice. For refugees are dying, and patients cannot get treatment. And should we not help them even if their governments do not deserve it? Soha listened to every perspective with careful attention. And when the discussion had run its course, she asked for a show of hands on a simple question. How many of you believe humanity should return to the Galactic Council? Fewer than 50 hands rose among the 3,000 gathered. How many of you believe we should continue on our independent path? The remaining hands went up. Along with cheers and applause that echoed through the plaza, Soha compiled the results and sent them to Ambassador Seong, along with similar reports from dozens of other community meetings across human space. And the message was clear. An overwhelming humanity did not want to go back. In Conference Room 7 on Border Station 12. Yuna presented the findings to High Arbiter Thelvosk with neither satisfaction nor regret in her voice. Our people have spoken, she said, and they do not wish to return to a relationship built on disrespect and inequality. And they have found peace and separation that they never experienced as council members. Then you doom your species to isolation, Thelvosk warned. Though his voice lacked conviction, we are not isolated, Yuna corrected him. For we have formed partnerships with independent species throughout the galaxy, and we trade with worlds that the Council never bothered to contact. And we have built something new rather than accepting something broken. She stood and signaled that the meeting was over. Return to your council and tell them what you have learned, she said. And tell them that humanity wishes them no ill will. And tell them that we will not interfere in their affairs. And tell them that we are at peace with our decision. Thelvosk rose slowly, and for a moment he seemed ready to argue or threaten or demand. But instead he simply nodded with something that might have been respect. You have changed, he observed quietly. For the humans I knew would never have refused to help those in need. Yuna smiled sadly. We have not changed, she replied. And we still help those in need, for our humanitarian missions operate in independent space every day. And our doctors treat refugees, and our engineers rebuild damaged infrastructure, and our teachers educate children who have no other opportunity. She paused to let her words sink in. But we choose who we help now, she continued. And we choose partners who respect us. And we will not sacrifice our dignity to save those who demonstrated that they never valued us at all. The council delegation departed without the agreement they had sought. And they carried back to council space the message that humanity would not return. Not for any price, not for any promise. Not for any reason, and in the empty conference room, Ambassador Yuna Seong sat alone for a long moment, thinking about the future that humanity would build without the council, and feeling certain that whatever challenges lay ahead, her people would face them together. 8 months after humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, the cracks in galactic civilization had grown into fractures that threatened to tear everything apart. Trade Minister Elixia stood before the Emergency Economic Committee of the Venn Collective, and her compound eyes reflected the red warning indicators that covered every display screen in the chamber, showing declining productivity and broken supply chains and mounting debts that her people had never faced before. The situation is critical, she reported in a voice that trembled despite her efforts to remain calm. And our manufacturing sector has contracted by 34% since the human withdrawal. And we cannot recover without external assistance. The committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For the Venn had always prided themselves on self-sufficiency. And admitting dependence on another species felt like admitting weakness. How did this happen? Demanded Senior Counselor Vexis. For we built our economy long before humans arrived, and we should not need them now. Elixia pulled up a complex diagram showing the interconnected trade routes that had once linked Venn space to the rest of the galaxy. Humans served as intermediaries, she explained. and they handled negotiations between species that refused to deal directly with each other. And they operated the logistics networks that moved goods across hostile borders. And they provided the neutral ground where agreements could be reached. She highlighted a series of broken connections on the diagram. The Karathi will not trade with us because of the territorial dispute from 3 centuries ago. And the Neth refused to share technology with any organic species. And the Delosi have retreated into isolation because they fear contamination. And humans were the only ones who could bridge these gaps. Then find other intermediaries. Vexus ordered impatiently. There are none, Elixir replied. For no other species was willing to work with everyone. And no other species was trusted by everyone. And humans earned that position through decades of fair dealing that we took for granted. The committee fell silent as they began to understand the true scope of what they had lost, far from vent space. In the lawless border regions between council territories, Warlord Kethran of the Vashka stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched his raiders tear apart a defenseless cargo convoy. The Vashka were predators by nature, evolved on a harsh world where only the strongest survived. And they had chafed under council restrictions for centuries, always wanting to take what they desired rather than negotiate for it. Human peacekeeping forces had kept them in check, patrolling the shipping lanes with ships that feared nothing and crews that could not be bribed or intimidated. And Kethran had learned to hate those stubborn humans who stood between him and easy prey. Now those humans were gone. Another successful hunt, his lieutenant reported with satisfaction. And the cargo is worth 3 times what we could have earned through legitimate trade. Kethran bared his fangs in the Vashka expression of pleasure. And no one to stop us, he growled. For the council peacekeepers are spread too thin, and they lack the courage that humans possessed. And we can take whatever we want from whoever we want. He looked at the star chart showing the expanding territory where his raiders operated freely. Send word to the other warlords, he commanded, and tell them that the old restrictions no longer apply. And tell them that the age of the Vashka has begun. Within weeks, raider attacks increased by 400% across the outer sectors. And refugees began streaming toward the core worlds. And the council found itself facing a crisis it had no idea how to handle on the human border. Engineer Minzu Cho supervised the construction of defensive platforms that would protect Earth space from any potential threats. And she worked alongside thousands of other humans who had returned from council space with skills and knowledge they were now applying to strengthen their own territory. The sensor grid is coming online ahead of schedule, her assistant reported. And the automated defense systems will be operational within 2 months. Minsu nodded with satisfaction as she reviewed the progress reports. Good work, she said. And make sure the crews know that quality matters more than speed. For these systems need to function perfectly when we need them. A visiting journalist from Earth approached her with questions about the project. Some people are saying that humanity should negotiate a return to the council, the journalist said. And they argue that isolation is too dangerous in a hostile galaxy. Minsu stopped working and turned to face the journalist with a patient expression. We are not isolated, she explained, and we are simply independent. And there is a difference that the council never understood. She gestured at the construction crews working efficiently around them. Look at what we have accomplished in 8 months, she said. For we have secured our borders and established new trade routes with independent species and built infrastructure that the council never allowed us to develop. And we did all of this without asking anyone for permission. But what about the threats? The journalist pressed. And what about the Vashka raids and the economic disruptions and the instability spreading across council space? Minsu shrugged with the casual confidence that humans often displayed when facing uncertainty. Those are council problems, she said. And they chose to treat us as lesser beings. and they chose to restrict our growth. And they chose to take our contributions for granted. And now they must live with the consequences of those choices. Do you not feel any responsibility to help them? We helped them for 47 years, Minsu replied. And they responded by voting unanimously to cage us forever, and responsibility flows both ways. And they showed us exactly how much responsibility they felt toward humanity. On the council station, High Arbiter Thelvosk convened an emergency session to address the mounting crises. But the chamber that had once held representatives of 347 species now showed empty seats scattered throughout. The assembly, the Delosi had withdrawn to focus on internal medical emergencies, and the Outer Rim worlds had stopped sending delegates because they could not afford the travel costs. And several minor species had simply disappeared from galactic politics entirely. We must take decisive action, Thelvosk declared to the diminished assembly. And we must restore order to the shipping lanes and stabilize the economy, and demonstrate that the council remains strong. With what resources? Demanded the Neth representative, their crystalline form flickering with skeptical colors. For our peacekeeping fleet is insufficient to patrol all threatened regions, and our economic reserves are depleted from supporting failing sectors. Then we must convince humanity to return, suggested a delegate from one of the outer worlds. For they created this crisis by leaving, and they have a moral obligation to help solve it. Thelvosk's scales flushed with anger at the suggestion. Humanity created nothing, he snarled. And this crisis was caused by temporary disruptions that weak-willed species have allowed to spiral out of control. And we will not beg lesser beings to save us from our own failures. But even as he spoke, reports continued arriving of new raids, new shortages, new problems that the council had no solutions for. And more delegates began quietly wondering if pride was worth the price they were paying in human space. Life continued with remarkable stability. As markets functioned, ships traveled safely, and children attended schools that taught them about a galaxy they might never see, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, the first secret messages began traveling from council space to human territory, sent by desperate officials who wanted to know if perhaps, just perhaps, there might be a way to undo the terrible mistake their civilization had made. The cargo vessel Steady Horizon made its final approach to Delosi Station 7, and Captain Dowan Park watched the familiar structure grow larger through the bridge viewport while his crew prepared for what would be their last delivery to this sector of space. 3 months had passed since Ambassador Sion walked out of the council chambers, and in that time, the galaxy had begun to learn what it meant to lose humanity. Captain Park had made this supply run for 11 years, bringing medical equipment and agricultural supplies to the remote station that served as a hub for 3 colonized worlds. And he knew every merchant and dock worker by name. And they knew him as the human who always had time for a friendly conversation. Today would be different. The docking clamps engaged with a familiar clunk, and Park led his crew through the airlock into the station's main trading hall, where dozens of alien merchants had gathered to meet them. Captain Park called Merchant Thelos, a Delosi with mottled blue skin and 4 arms that waved in greeting. Please tell me you have reconsidered, and please tell me you will continue your routes after today. Park shook his head with genuine regret in his eyes. I'm sorry, old friend, he said, but Earth has recalled all commercial vessels from council space, and this is my final delivery. The merchants surrounded him with offers that would have seemed impossible just months ago, as the Karathi trader who once charged humans triple prices now offered a permanent discount of 50%. And the vent supplier who had refused to shake human hands now practically begged for continued business. Name your price, Thelos said desperately, and we will pay whatever you ask. for no other species will make these runs. And our colonies depend on these supplies. Captain Park thought about the years of unfair treatment, the tariffs that applied only to human ships, the inspections that delayed his cargo while other vessels passed freely. And he felt a moment of satisfaction that he quickly pushed aside, because revenge was not why they were leaving. This is not about price, he explained patiently, and it was never about price. For we asked only to be treated as equals, and you refused. And now we are going home. He completed his delivery, accepted payment at the standard rate, and walked back to his ship without looking at the desperate faces that watched him go across the galaxy. Similar scenes played out at thousands of locations as human workers quietly packed their belongings and returned to Earth's space console. Jinseo Beek worked from a temporary office on Border Station 12, processing the endless stream of departure documents that marked humanity's withdrawal from Council space. And her desk was covered with requests from alien governments, seeking exceptions and special arrangements. The Neth Collective wishes to retain their human engineering team, her assistant reported, reading from a datapad, and they offered triple salary plus diplomatic immunity plus permanent residency rights. Denied, Beek said without looking up. And please send the standard response. The Karathi Regional Authority requests that human doctors remain at the central medical facility until replacement staff can be trained, which they estimate will take approximately 4 years. Denied. And send the standard response. The assistant hesitated before reading the next request. Director Morvax of Delosi Medical Station 9 asked for a personal meeting to discuss the humanitarian crisis that will result from the departure of human medical staff. And he says that patients will die without them. Consul Beek finally looked up, and her expression showed the weight of the decision she had been making for weeks. I know Director Morvax, she said quietly, and he was one of the few who treated our people with respect. And he genuinely cares about his patients, regardless of species. She paused and then shook her head. But we cannot make exceptions. For if we allow some humans to stay, then the Council will use them as leverage against us. And they will never believe that our departure is permanent. So the answer must be the same for everyone. What should I tell him? The assistant asked. Beek thought for a long moment before answering. Tell him that humanity acts as one, and that we are sorry for the suffering this will cause, but that we did not create this situation, and we cannot sacrifice our future to fix problems that the Council chose to ignore. On Delosi Medical Station 9. Director Morvax received the response and felt his heart sink within his chest. For he had worked alongside human doctors for 20 years and had learned to respect their strange combination of empathy and determination. His station served patients that other facilities refused to accept, including victims of the Ven Neural Plague and survivors of Karathi, territorial conflicts, and refugees from worlds that the Council had abandoned to their fate. And human doctors had always been willing to treat them. Now those doctors were leaving, and no one was coming to replace them. Dr. Yumbi Han stood in her office, surrounded by boxes, as she prepared for departure. And she looked at the director with sadness in her eyes. I do not want to leave, she admitted. And these patients need me. And I became a doctor to help people regardless of what species they belong to. Then stay, Morvax pleaded, and I will protect you. And the Council cannot force you to leave. Yumbi shook her head slowly. If I stay, I abandon my own people. And Earth needs every doctor we have, because we do not know what challenges we will face alone. And I must stand with humanity, even when it breaks my heart to do so. She handed him a data chip containing all of her patient files and treatment protocols. Train your own doctors, she said, and teach them that every life has value. And do not let them become like the Council. And maybe someday we can work together again on the Galactic Council Station. High Arbiter Thelvosk reviewed the weekly reports with growing irritation. For the disruptions he had dismissed as temporary showed no signs of improving. Trade volume in the outer sectors has declined by 18%, his advisor reported nervously. And medical emergencies are increasing due to staff shortages. And several independent shipping companies have refused to fill the routes, abandoned by human vessels. Why will they not fill the routes? Thelvosk demanded. Because humans were the only ones willing to serve certain areas, the advisor explained. And the profit margins were too low for other species. But humans did it anyway because they believed in maintaining connections between communities. The High Arbiter waved a dismissive hand. These are minor adjustments, he insisted. And the galaxy functioned for 10,000 years before humans arrived. And it will continue to function now that they have chosen isolation. But as the weeks passed, the minor adjustments became major problems, and the problems became crises. And species that had voted unanimously against humanity began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. Trade Minister Elixia watched her economic projections grow worse each day. And she thought about the human ambassador who had warned them that respect was not optional. And she began to compose a secret message to human space, asking if reconciliation might still be possible. The message would receive no response in human space. Billions of people watched the news reports about the withdrawal and felt a mixture of pride and uncertainty, for they had chosen a path that no species had ever walked before. And they did not know where it would lead, but they knew one thing with absolute certainty: they would walk it together. The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched upward like the inside of a cathedral, its walls lined with seats for representatives of 347 species. And at its center stood a single human woman who knew that everything was about to change, Ambassador Yuna. Xiang had served humanity for 23 years, first as a junior diplomat on trade missions, then as a negotiator during the border conflicts, and finally as the sole voice of Earth in this ancient assembly that had governed the galaxy for 10,000 years before humans ever looked up at the stars. She stood straight with her hands folded behind her back, wearing the formal black uniform of the human diplomatic corps with the golden Earth seal on her chest. And she waited as the final votes appeared on the massive display screen that floated above the central podium. The boundary accord had passed unanimously. 346 species had voted to permanently restrict human expansion to just 12 star systems, while the Karathi controlled 800, the Ven held 600, and even the newly arrived Delosi possessed 73 worlds of their own. High Arbiter Thelvosk rose from his elevated seat at the head of the chamber, his reptilian scales gleaming under the artificial lights, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he addressed the assembly. "The matter is settled," he declared, his forked tongue flickering between each word. "And humanity will accept these boundaries as befitting a species of their age and development. For we have shown great generosity in granting them membership at all, and they should be grateful for the protection and trade access they receive." Yuna did not move as the translator device in her ear converted his words from the Karathi language, and she felt the eyes of every delegate upon her, waiting for her to bow her head and accept the decision as humans had always done. She thought of the 47 years since first contact, when humans had eagerly joined the council, believing they would find friendship and cooperation among the stars. And she remembered every insult, every unfair treaty, every time humanity had been told to wait their turn and be patient. She thought of the human doctors who had cured the Delosi plague, when no other species would risk infection, and the human engineers who had rebuilt the Ven homeworld after the great earthquake, and the human soldiers who had died protecting Karathi colonies from raiders while receiving nothing but contempt. In return, the chamber grew quiet as Yuna reached up to her chest and unpinned the golden earth. Seal from her uniform, Ambassador Siong, Thelvosk said with a hint of warning in his voice. What are you doing? Yuna walked forward to the central podium where speakers addressed the full council, and she placed the seal gently on the ancient stone surface that had held the symbols of 1,000 civilizations over the millennia. I am doing what I should have done years ago, she said, and her voice carried clearly through the chamber's perfect acoustics. And I am ending humanity's participation in this council. Effective immediately, a ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the assembled delegates, and several of them actually laughed, their various vocal organs producing sounds of disbelief and amusement. Trade Minister Alexia of the Ven leaned forward in her seat, her compound eyes reflecting the lights of the chamber, and she watched with an expression that her human colleagues had learned to recognize as concern. You cannot be serious, Thelvosk said, and he descended from his elevated position to stand before the human ambassador, towering over her by nearly a meter, for no species has ever voluntarily left a council, and no species could survive in this galaxy without our protection and trade networks. Then we will be the first, Yuna replied without stepping back or lowering her gaze. And we will discover what we can build on our own, without partners who treat us as servants rather than equals. This is foolishness born of wounded pride, the High Arbiter said, and he gestured dismissively with one clawed hand. And you will return within 6 months, begging for readmission. And we may or may not grant it depending on how thoroughly you apologize for this tantrum. Yuna smiled, and it was not a warm expression. You have made one mistake that your species makes often, she said. And that mistake is assuming that humans think the way you do. For we do not measure our worth by the approval of others, and we do not need your permission to exist. She turned to face the full assembly, and her voice rose to reach every corner of the vast chamber. For 47 years, humanity has given everything to this council and received nothing but restrictions and disrespect in return. And we have cured your diseases, rebuilt your worlds, defended your borders, and asked only for fair treatment. But today, you have shown us that fair treatment will never come. So we will seek our future elsewhere. The Karathi delegate made a sound of contempt, and the crystalline Neth representative flickered with colors that indicated mockery. And dozens of other species expressed their amusement at what they saw as a childish display. But Trade Minister Alexia did not laugh, and neither did the delegates from the Outer Rim worlds who had worked closely with human merchants and doctors. And they watched silently as Ambassador Siong walked toward the exit. All human personnel will be withdrawn from Council space within 90 days, Yuna announced without turning around. And all treaties, trade agreements, and mutual defense pacts are hereby terminated. And any species wishing to maintain relations with Earth may contact us through independent channels. But we will never return to this chamber, High Arbiter Thelvosk called after her with anger creeping into his voice. You are condemning your species to isolation and poverty, he shouted. And when your colonies fail and your people starve, remember that you chose this path. Yuna stopped at the doorway and looked back one final time. We survived ice ages and plagues and wars that nearly destroyed us, she said. And we built civilizations from nothing and reached the stars through our own determination. And we did all of this before we ever knew you existed. So do not presume to tell us what we can survive. She walked through the door and let it close behind her. And the sound echoed through the chamber like the ending of an era. In the silence that followed, Trade Minister Alexia quietly accessed her personal terminal and began calculating how many supply chains in her sector depended on human logistics companies. And the number she reached made her mandibles click with anxiety. High Arbiter Thelvosk returned to his seat and dismissed the assembly with a wave of his hand, telling everyone that the humans would come to their senses soon enough and that this disruption would be forgotten within a year. But as the delegates filed out of the chamber, many of them found themselves thinking about the human doctors in their hospitals and the human engineers in their factories and the human teachers in their schools. And they wondered for the first time what their worlds would look like without them on the observation deck of the station. Ambassador Yuna Seong stood alone and watched the stars that humanity would now navigate without allies or protectors, and she felt no fear. Only a quiet certainty that her species had faced worse odds before and would face them again. Her communicator chimed with a message from Earth, and she read the single line from the Secretary General. That simply said, "Well done," followed by orders to begin the withdrawal immediately. Yuna straightened her uniform and walked toward the human diplomatic vessel that would carry her home, and behind her, the Galactic Council continued its ancient routines without any idea that the galaxy they had controlled for 10,000 years was about to change forever.